Welcome to Cover, the World Affairs Councils of America's monthly author series, which we bring to you for 1 hour. We're delighted to have a special guest today, Congressman Ro Khanna, who represents the 17th District in California in the House of Representatives. And our moderator will be Philip Yun, who runs the World Affairs Council in San Francisco. The book we're discussing today is Dignity in a Digital Age, which came out just this month. And Congressman Khanna joins us from his car outside Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., where we have weather that's matching San Francisco today, flirting with the 60s. It's wonderful to have you. Congressman Khanna has taught economics at Stanford. He has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce in the Obama administration and represented several tech companies and startups in private practice. His book looks at the digital divide and how not inclusive we are. We are politically divided in this country. We're also not able to access technology and opportunities and the prosperity that tech has brought us in the same ways. And he's got an answer for that. And to bring us this program, I'm delighted to introduce you to Philip Yun, our moderator. As I said, he not only is the CEO of World Affairs in San Francisco, which he took over just months before the pandemic and has sustained the council wonderfully despite those challenges. Philip, along with Ray Suarez, hosts World Affairs, a broadcast every Monday night at 8 p.m. on KQED Public Radio in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it's carried in a syndicated fashion to NPR and PRX stations. So you all should look at your local listings for World Affairs. It's your guide to a changing world. And now we begin Cover to Cover with Philip and Congressman Khanna.
Oh, thank you so much, Bill. It's great. Thank you for the opportunity. And I just wanted to thank you, Waka, and the staff for putting this all together. I'm Philip Yun, and I'm just so pleased to be part of this special program with Congressman Ro Khanna. Congressman Ro Khanna, we are just thrilled to have you here. We're delighted to have the chance to talk with you about your book and to preview it with our audience. For those of you who are not familiar with California, Congressman Khanna, as we are in San Francisco, Congressman Khanna represents what is the heart of Silicon Valley. And so in terms of logistics, I'm going to probably, we'll talk for about 30 minutes or so. And then we're going to, while you're listening, as you hear certain things, please type in your questions in the Q&A function. And then I'll go through those as best I can. And what we're going to do here is probably touch as much as we can on the book to give all of you a flavor for the incredible topics, a number of topics that he covers, and then you can ask questions specifically of him as you wish. So welcome, Congressman Khanna. It's the first time we've really met, and it's a real treat to speak with you today.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Bill, for giving me this opportunity, and thank you to the World Affairs Councils of America. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So congratulations on the book. I have to say, it's really an impressive synthesis of technology, politics, business, and law. And so let's get started. Let me sort of lay this out really quickly. I was struck by what you highlighted as the central aspiration of the book. And it was really, in a sense, what you said was to lessen the bitterness and hyperpartisanship that divides our country in a very turbulent time. I mean, that is a huge task, right? And you lay out very specific ideas about the promise of technology and the digital economy as a big part to any solution here. And so the way I would, as I read it, and you can tell me if I'm misinterpreting it, you advocate for a new kind of capitalism and a new kind of citizenship, which you formulate in really two buckets. First, you focus on jobs and how to expand tech to places people and places that have been left behind. I guess you would say increasing the size of the pie and making it and distributing it more equitably. And then you make this case about the creation of economic opportunity and wealth by tech. For it to be worthwhile, it's got to be respectful of individuals and doesn't manipulate them. So let's start with the first part of this, okay? And I love what you do is because you talk a lot about stories. So in the first part of the book, you talk about jobs in the 21st century, and you start off by talking about a gentleman named Alex Hughes in Eastern Kentucky. So let's start from there.
That's a pretty good summary synopsis of the thesis. Alex Hughes is this remarkable individual in Paintsville, Kentucky, who is hired by an Indian American CEO, Ankur Gopal at Interap. He had been unemployed for a number of months. He had been in and out of jobs after the coal business took a hit. And he is in a region that the Republican member of Congress there, Hal Rogers, describes as Silicon Holler, an initiative that he had supported, that Rogers had supported to bring new tech jobs to Paintsville, Kentucky. And as part of the Appalachian Regional Commission, they fund Interap to do this program. And Hughes finds a job at Interap, and he realizes it's similar to the technical jobs he's done in the past and the manufacturing jobs that are important to his region. This is not Alex Hughes becoming some computer software coder or thinking of this caricature of turning coal miners into coders. This is Alex Hughes, who's building refrigerators and building dishwashers, but he's going to do that making them smart appliances. And he works for General Electric as part of Interap and has a successful economic prospects now and part of the middle class. And he doesn't have to move to do it. He gets to stay in Paintsville and stay in Kentucky, a place he loves. And he gets to work with people in the coast. He gets to work with people in in Chicago and Atlanta. And so this sort of anecdote story is about the possibility of bringing new prosperity to places that have been left out. So you have economic revitalization without cultural displacement and creating distributed teams so that there's not as much of a harsh disconnect between what's happening in Silicon Valley and other parts of the country.
Can you talk a little bit more? Because I was really struck by what, the notion of place, right? And how important that is to, the people and, the geography. I mean, can you talk a little bit about how, about that idea, which I thought was really quite good?
Well, place matters to all of us. I think it's been a blind spot in how much place matters. It matters to people in San Francisco, and they don't want to just get up and move to Kentucky. And it matters equally to people in Kentucky who love the community, love their traditions, love being close to family. Now, some folks move. I moved. My parents moved from India, and moving is great in terms of those who want to. But a central thesis of the book is you shouldn't be forced to abandon your hometown if that's not what you want, that you can have an unfettered capitalism that is not sensitive to location, to place, to giving people the opportunity to thrive in the communities that they value. And that for so long, as $11 trillion of market cap accumulated in my district and the surrounding areas, other parts of the country were told, okay, your jobs have gone offshore, you've been deindustrialized, go move to the opportunity. And this was A, unrealistic given costs, and B, in some sense offensive to people who wanted to have pride in their community. And so part of the book says we've got to have place-based policies that distribute these 25 million new digital jobs that are going to intersect with manufacturing, retail, healthcare, and going to be prosperous. And that you may actually induce or allow a culture to emerge that is rooted in community and yet exposed to plurality because of remote work and all of the interconnections that the digital age involve. In fact, I had a great conversation with the sociologist Arlie Hochschild, who described it as a cosmo-local culture that is emerging in different places, and that's a theme throughout the book.
You're talking about this idea. I mean, one of the things that you specifically mentioned is this idea of democratizing wealth, right? And how, in this part, you were talking how to expand it to less populated regions of America, which is geography, right? And what you just explained to us in certain ways is a reason for why there's so much, one reason for the polarization and divisiveness in our country. You also discuss wealth creation has to be more democratic and equitable, and you talk about race and gender. Can you explain your thinking about this?
So there are two parts of democratizing wealth generation. The standard part, which I believe in, that you ought to be taxing billionaires so people can have healthcare and education, and we can invest in some of the building blocks of what allow people to flourish. But my argument in the book is that that's not sufficient, that it's not sufficient to redistribute post-production, that we have to give people the opportunity to be part of the productive economy. That Cleveland was the Silicon Valley of the 20th century, that so many of these places are places that want to produce and have economic contributions and build wealth. And that's equally true of Black and brown communities. The racial wealth gap is 10 to 1, $10 for every white family compared to $1 for an African American family because of slavery and Jim Crow and redlining. And it's growing. You can't solve or tackle the racial wealth gap if you don't address the racial wealth generation gap. And I met so many young people, African American, who wanted to start a business, wanted to have an opportunity in technology, want to create prosperity, and don't have the avenues, don't have the ability, have the talent, have the desire, but don't have the ability to get funded. And so part of one of the chapters focuses on how do we change this? How do we make technology and modern day wealth generation more accessible to communities that have been left out? And I reference a joint op-ed that I had the honor to do with John Lewis, where he says technology rights are the new civil rights.
So again, as we hop along, you talked about geography, you've talked about race and gender, and there was a really, I thought was a great chapter on working class, right? And you have the story about Courtney Brown explaining, what needs to be done in that particular area as well. Can you just briefly let us know about that and how you came to that sort of conclusion?
Well, while we're on Zoom, we should remember that 2/3 of jobs don't require a laptop, don't require a phone in terms of actual communication, a smartphone used for the job itself. They're physical jobs. And those are the jobs, by the way, that were the most essential in the pandemic. And those jobs are not often well paid enough. They don't have enough dignity in the workplace. They don't have enough freedom in the workplace. And I describe Courtney Brown because it's sort of, if you hit the lottery, you work for one of the richest companies ever invented in human history, and you still can't make enough money or have basic protections at the workplace or feel like you're empowered at the workplace, how does the digital age work for you? It doesn't. And you've had a lot of people at these Amazon warehouses who used to have $30 jobs at manufacturing plants, and now we're getting 15 to 17 bucks. The only thing worse than having a human boss is probably having an algorithm as your boss, and don't have much say in their working conditions. And then you've also had a situation where the tech multiplier, though it's created jobs, has also led to a service class that has seen in tech metropolises like Silicon Valley, rents skyrocketed, but their salaries not keep up. And I said, you can't have dignity in a digital age if that prosperity doesn't also translate into the working class who may not have these digital jobs and who are increasingly separated from those who do have these digital jobs. And what are the policies we need so that they can prosper in the modern economy?
So, what I found really impressive about about the book was just it's not about explaining the problem, it's how to deal with the problem. And you give us so many, whole host of policy recommendations. So, there's just so many, and they're all really, really interesting, and I love, pretty much all of them to some degree. But can you give us maybe an example in this particular space in the working class? What's something that is particularly important to you in terms of the policy proposals or reforms that we need to institute?
Well, here the book is inspired by FDR's famous phrase of bold, persistent experimentation. I don't think every policy I recommend that everyone would agree with, but the hope is that it starts a conversation about ideas that can address this. One of the simple ideas is to give workers more say over their lives at the workplace. If you believe in human freedom as the central to the American aspiration, and we're spending 40 to 50 to 60 hours at work, what is the freedom we have at work, and what are the indignities we suffer at work? And so I say workers really need to be have some seat of representation on these companies' boards, or have some say in how they're using technology, have some say so that they don't just feel as appendages to robots, have some say over their workplace conditions, and of course, be paid reasonably, which all are possible in companies that are producing enormous, enormous wealth. And I have a number of these kind of recommendations in that chapter.
Okay, and so let's skip to another part. Your book has two parts, and I alluded to that at the very beginning. So the second part of your book, you talk about dignity, and I found that really interesting. And you talked about dignity and the threat of an unregulated tech industry in the midst of the threat that a digital economy and tech poses to individuals. And you had this very interesting concept of 21st century citizenship. What is that going to look like? So for me, I just found the use of dignity, that's the first time I've heard it in this context, and I thought it was really, really interesting, and I really liked it. So can you talk about dignity and catch it, sort of set the stage for us on that, and then also, how is the digital technology or the digital economy fundamentally different from other forms of communication? You talk about this as well.
Well, the dignity concept is borrowed or influenced heavily from philosopher Martha Nussbaum. And Nussbaum's view is if we all have intrinsic value in human life, and if every value it matters, if every human being values, then what does the political project owe individuals? And that is the big question. Of course, she has a brilliant book, Fragility of Goodness, of how much can we have a dignified life absent with differences of fortune. And the Stoics believed it didn't matter what the material conditions were, anyone can be dignified just intrinsically. And Nussbaum says, no, there needs to be some external conditions to allow you to have dignity. I don't get into that philosophic dispute or discussion, but what I say is, in the modern context, if we believe everyone has dignity, it means two things. It means giving them the opportunity for productive capacity to be a contributing person in the economy, and that a lot of people don't feel that. They feel that they've been left out of modern economic production and wealth generation. But it also means giving them some sense of agency as citizens, as participants. And people don't feel that. They feel often that they go online and their data is taken, and then they are being surveilled based on that data. And that data is being used against their will to help candidates that they may not support. It's being used to target people who are the most vulnerable, to see QAnon grow. And so they don't have the freedom to think with privacy online. And there's not the same sense of participation online as equals in a deliberative process. We've perfected the town hall for 200 years. And there is a sense of, as a citizen, what does it mean when you come to a town hall to contribute? But we don't have that online. And so if part of leading a dignified life means that you should have the ability to be a citizen with equal value in the public sphere, what does this mean in the digital public sphere, and how do we attain that ideal? And here, of course, the thinking is heavily influenced by Habermas, who coins the phrase a public sphere in 1962, and has this beautiful line that newspapers have a commercial basis but aren't fully commercialized. And by that, Habermas meant that apart from government, all of these institutions emerged in bourgeois culture of newspapers that had some sense of a stakeholder responsibility to democracy. It wasn't just about monetary meeting profits that mattered, but also they had a social responsibility. And I asked, well, what does that mean in the modern public sphere? What is the social obligation of these companies to see themselves as stakeholders of democracy, and what are the regulations that are needed?
Okay, and then so you also made a big point, I think, about how, one of the reasons for sort of advancing this sort of new agenda was because fundamentally how different digital technology is from other forms of communication. And could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the digital forms are different because they're data extracting. I mean, other places, the printing press or the telephone didn't extract data. So you're subject now to manipulation, and you have to give thousands of data points. So when you go into a store You may have to tell your name, you may have to write something, but you don't have every part of your interaction as data that you're giving to that store. You're doing that online. And what is the protection online for making sure that your data isn't used in ways that violate your sense of what you want to impact you want? Most famously in Cambridge Analytica, where people's data was taken and used to help a candidate they may not have supported. And this is where privacy is not just a personal issue. People will say, I don't care, my data is being taken, who cares? It doesn't really bother me. But it's as a societal harm if that data is then taken to perfect the ability to target certain groups, and that targeting is what's enabled the growth of QAnon and growth of hate groups and the growth of misinformation. And all of it is because of the construction of social profiles that are put together based of all of our data. And so I discuss, well, what does it mean if we can have affirmative consent before our data is taken? How do we simplify all of the terms of services that most of us just click through? What are the fiduciary obligations of these companies when it comes to use of data?
And then, so when we go to this section, I mean, it was quite impressive. I mean, you had basically, just to let the readers, I mean, our listeners know, there are 4 sort of sections where you paid particular attention to. You talked about protecting our freedoms in the internet, which you've alluded to. You've talked about, internet deliberations and civil discourse. And you've alluded to that. You talk also about science and its place in a modern democracy and foreign policy. And you give specific policy actions. And I note that we don't have all the time to go through all of that. So I just wanted the audience to know that those are the topics. I also wanted to remind you, if you do have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll get to them in a few moments. But I wanted to bring up, maybe we'll have time, probably not to talk about all 4, but because we're the World Affairs Councils of America, I wanted to focus on foreign policy. Okay, surprise, surprise. Okay, so we have foreign policy. You talk about foreign policy, the role of technology in foreign policy. You talk about expanding a definition of national security and decentralization. I mean, I thought those are 2 interesting ideas. Can you talk about those 2 things and what you mean by that?
Well, 2 things. First, the hope of technology at the heyday was that somehow it would lead to the democratization of voice, and that it would lead to people with the Arab Spring. And you remember back then, technology leaders were held up as sort of visionaries. And I talk about how that also, though, went sideways, where these same platforms now, Steve Bannon is talking about a global solidarity of the digital commons for authoritarian ideas, and right-wing populism with Bolsonaro and people in Europe. And so that just because you have digital forms doesn't mean that you have the emergence of liberal democracy. And a lot of the book is thinking about how do we create these public spaces, digital public spaces, transnational public spaces that do have liberal democratic values and not just the replication of authoritarian or anti-liberal values. And it's also talking about what does it mean in terms of people to have more of a voice on foreign policy. On a positive, it may make us less likely to go to war, and more of a left-right coalition emerging against foreign entanglements. On a negative sense, that populism may lead to an insular nationalism at times, and a lack of engagement from the world. But what is clear is that the decentralization of foreign policy means that it's no longer as much an elite few people shaping world affairs, and more people are being involved in it. And then the expansion of national security is simply to say that, past 3 years, when I ask someone what they think is the biggest security issue, they probably say the pandemic. And some of the younger folks would say the climate. And so, yes, there's obviously the traditional national security that we can't ignore. Russia's threat in Ukraine, the unjustified aggression. But even that has a component of cybersecurity and cyber threats. And we just have to think about, though, the security of people in a much broader sense than just great power politics.
So to follow up on that, again, just to give people a flavor of, some of the policy recommendations you describe, you talk about a Manhattan Project for cybersecurity. Can you give us a flavor of that, please?
Well, we're actually very good, I would argue, at the cybersecurity of our most sensitive weapons and most sensitive security. I mean, we've had breaches, we've developed a great amount of protocol and technology to guard that. But we're not. But that only applies to some of the most sensitive military technology, nuclear technology. It's actually not even there in the whole of government at agencies like Treasury and Commerce, where we saw what happened with SolarWinds. It's not there certainly for a lot of the private sector and critical infrastructure. So I talk about what can we have in terms of the investments, whether it's software verification at the ideal stage, or whether it's some kind of form of liability regime, whether it's as simple as making sure that the default settings are having cybersecurity safeguards to be on as opposed to off. What can we do really to mobilize this country to institute cybersecurity in private companies and in agencies of government that aren't just the most sensitive targets? And that's something that I believe our government needs to do.
Okay. And let me then finally, let me touch on, I think, so you wrap all this up, you do talk about science, and again, I encourage people to read his policy recommendations. I mean, it would be a great book for people to discuss and the merits of those specific recommendations. But I wanted people to get a flavor of something that seems very much a part of you and is really part of, as you described, part of your background, really, growing up in different part of the country, and your family. You talk about, you kind of close with a vision about how this country can be prosperous, multiracial, multi-religious, and democratic. And you call it democratic patriotism. Can you talk a little bit about that for us? Because I think it's I think it really encompasses in many respects your vision for, an organizing principle about how we need to be with each other.
Well, it's a hopeful vision for the nation, and it's reflective on what we're trying to do, which is become the first major multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy in the world. I said this once, and I got all these tweets saying, what about Canada? Canada is 86% white. Britain is 80-some% white. Australia is 80-some% white. We're 60% white, non-Hispanic. When my parents immigrated here in the 1960s, European immigration was 90%. That's down to now about 15%. The country, as immigrants, is really an extraordinary diversity of cultures. And I close with Frederick Douglass's speech about a composite nation, which is one of the great speeches. If you haven't read it, I put it right up there with Lincoln's second inaugural or the Gettysburg Address. And Douglass is, who was enslaved for 20 years, in 1869 defends Chinese immigration. And he says, even if you disagree with Chinese culture, it'll be subject to the freer air of America, and a composite nation will emerge. And America, Douglass proclaims, is on the ascent. And I say, of course, I believe America is still on the ascent. You can't help but have that view as someone with my story of a grandfather who spent 4 years in jail with Gandhi, parents who came here as immigrants, born in Philadelphia in 1976, our bicentenary, elected to represent arguably the most prosperous place in the world, an Asian majority district, Silicon Valley, at the age of 40. I believe our country is still on the ascent in trying to perfect this multiracial build, this multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. And what I love about Douglass's vision of patriotism is it actually goes beyond the Rawlsian conception or the Habermasian conception that what unifies a nation is just a commitment to procedural justice. Yes, that matters, but nations are defined by more than that. It's not just allegiance to a constitution, it's a tradition and culture, and whether you like baseball and movies. And Douglass has a view that that culture can emerge as long as it's continually dynamic and changing over time, and as long as we have equality in shaping it. And so the ability to have technological prosperity in every part of the country is a prerequisite to trying to achieve this vision, but certainly not sufficient. And the book ends with reflections on how we can achieve that vision, which in my view requires sort of a friendliness towards other cultures and a rootingness for them, which is a very quintessentially American tradition and one that I have every confidence we will eventually achieve.
Okay, thank you. So we have a lot of questions, and
I
apologies
assume
in
that's
advance.
a good thing.
Yeah, it's great. No, it's great. So apologies in advance if I cannot get to it. We also had some questions by people that were pre-submitted when they registered, some
Oh,
of which have been answered. So let me start with that, since they took the time to ask this. So here's a pretty pointed one. Do you see Congress regulating Facebook and other social media companies anytime soon?
this is the hardest question. I can answer theoretically, but whether Congress is going to do something or not, who knows? I mean, they should, they must, but it's been frustrating for me over the last 5 years to see even the basics not be done. I'm going to be introducing a bill coming soon that says very simply that we should at least regulate these Facebook and Instagram and what they're doing to teenagers. It's appalling. They know they're causing depression. They know they're causing anxiety. They know they're causing further thoughts of suicide. It's basic consumer harm, and yet we're letting them sell this product. So I'm saying that the FTC should regulate it. Like that, we also should have a carve out to Section 230 to say you can't incite violence. I mean, Facebook knew prior to January 6th that there were assassination attempts on Vice President Pence and lawmakers with specific times, specific days, specific place. That's not protected under our First Amendment, under Brandenburg, but it's protected by Section 230. There was no responsibility for them to remove that content. We need well-targeted reform. And the challenge, candidly, is that some of the bills in Congress are overbroad. Some of them don't understand the nuance of technology. And I write in one of the more provocative chapters of how these CEOs, who I all know, they come to Congress, they're fine getting yelled at, they don't mind having a viral negative moment, and then they know nothing's going to get done. So we need more technological literacy in Congress, and we need to actually get behind nuanced legislation and push back against some of the CEOs saying that it can just be the Wild West.
So there are a lot of questions that have to do with misinformation in some form or another. And the basic frame, and you alluded to this before, was that there's so much out there and it's going to continue to exist. What do you think are essential for us to be doing right now to kind of, as best we can, rein it in? I mean, one of the things I just, heard on the radio this morning is, about this law related to sharing voter information to prevent fraud. I mean, some right-wing, some group that believes in conspiracy theories basically is pushing, and then suddenly comes into the mainstream and people have to respond to this thing in some way. Any ideas, thoughts?
Well, we need some basic regulations on, I alluded to one, on consumer safety. I mean, you shouldn't be able to have information that threatens the public health and causes public health crises. You shouldn't be able to have information that hurts minors. You shouldn't be able to put out information that is a blatant suppression of the vote. These are guardrails we have against the First Amendment already. There's not an absolute protection of speech under our own First Amendment tradition. And so some of these things we need to regulate. Then John Stuart Mill, when he was talking about the marketplace of ideas, wasn't talking about bots contributing basically, or internet trolls. That wasn't sort of this idea of deliberation. 30-40% of the misinformation is bots. So just regulating trolls on the internet would help clean up the spaces. Then third, we need more competition. It shouldn't be that Dorsey and Zuckerberg get to decide the discursive spaces. We need more of them. We need a public space as well in local communities and nationally. A PBS of the internet is one option, but it's not the only option. There are good uses of anger and sometimes a messy speech, but it should be one option, and we need many more discursive spaces. And then finally, we need a disclosure requirement so that these companies are forced to tell what they're doing with the algorithms, who they're targeting, what groups are there. Right now, we don't have a lot of that disclosure. If we have those kind of regulations, will lead to reform. And then the hope is that we start to see a social media ethics emerge, much like we saw what Habermas called the journalistic ethics, where newspapers cared more than their bottom line.
Here's a question from Patrick. He says, Congressman Khanna, thank you for your time, your book. He's going to read it. He says, Patrick says, here in Tennessee, we have blue bubbles and in a very red state, an extremely divided political culture. The rural areas are in need of tech infusion, as you referred to, but it seems the decisions to spread those things of tech jobs is in the hands of big tech companies. What are the starter mechanisms if grassroots approaches can't get it done? Any suggestions?
It's a great question. And I think it starts with a sense of respect for rural communities. And you're absolutely right. The divide isn't between red and blue states as much as it is between rural and urban America and suburban America. I look at what Intel is doing in New Albany, Ohio, where they're starting a new semiconductor manufacturing plant and 3,000 manufacturing jobs there. 7,000 construction jobs. I talked to the CEO of Intel in my district, and he says it's a new nationalism, a new enthusiasm and excitement there. That's what we ought to be doing across this country, so that people know these are the jobs their parents and grandparents had. These are technical jobs that they know how to do to build things. It's just to build things in the 21st century. And to demythologize what these jobs are. Not all of them even require a 4-year degree. But we need government policy for that. We need government to be partnering with these companies to build new factories, new production facilities. We need to incentivize them to be in mid-sized cities in the Midwest and the South and in Black and brown communities. We need to incentivize these companies to hire people from rural America and Black and brown communities if they're getting huge billions of dollars of IT contracts. So if we have the right policies, we can have more economic possibility in the 21st century. But the point is not to go make everyone a coder. That would be a very boring world. The point is, if there's this engine of massive wealth generation with 25 million digital jobs that are crossing all the sectors, we need some of those in communities across America. It makes no sense if a modern automobile is a computer on wheels to have a lot of the technical parts of that job be done in Silicon Valley as opposed to Michigan. We need communities to have sufficient technology proficiency to be engines of wealth generation as opposed to just wealth extraction.
Okay, so we have a question from someone who lives in the Bay Area. Thank you for your service, Representative Khanna. On a very pragmatic matter, how can we get internet access in rural communities in California? Small towns only 30 miles north of San Francisco have whole neighborhoods that do not have reliable internet. And we've seen this particularly in COVID. And even in San Francisco, you have to pay more for extra equipment if you want wireless to work well enough for a Zoom meeting. Basically she's asking, what can we do? Any suggestions?
Well, this is table stakes. We shouldn't, frankly, even be discussing in 2022 affordable broadband access. Even if the whole country had affordable broadband access, we'd still be only 2 out of 10 in terms of what we need to do to get equal participation or an equal opportunity for digital success. It is appalling that in 2022 we haven't been able to achieve this. Hopefully the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which puts $60 billion towards this, will make a big dent. And it funds both the private sector and municipalities to get that last mile of broadband. It funds also the FCC to make sure that it's affordable. For a lot of places, they may have the access, but it's $35 a month, and that's not affordable. So the combination of both incentivizing the private sector or having the last mile done by the government if the private sector doesn't want, and the affordability piece, I think should get us there. I'm hoping with the infrastructure bill, that was a big achievement, that we can get there by 2025. We may need 20, 30 billion more dollars than the 60 billion that was allocated, but this is a big start.
Okay, so here's one about, let's see, the great engine of upward mobility you rightly identify as entrepreneurship. How do we not only create more dignified employment, but also produce, more importantly, founders, CEOs, and entrepreneurial success stories from working America? How do we enable Americans beyond Silicon Valley not only to earn more income, but to invest and grow equity and capital? You can take whatever question of that group you would like.
Well, some of this it can happen with technology, right? I think Airbnb and Shopify and to some extent the decentralization that Web 3.0 and cryptocurrency may enable may allow more people to be entrepreneurial and have small businesses and be able to sell into even global markets without having to have concentration. But what we need in the beginning is the access to capital. Capital is so concentrated. So if you have the decentralization of some of these jobs, if you have more of the investment of technical capability in these communities, then you have more access to capital. Then someone may say, okay, now I'm going to take a risk and start a business. But it is a luxury in some sense to dream to take a risk. It's a luxury in some sense to be an entrepreneur. I mean, there's a level of safety net that you could fall back on. Either that's a fancy education. I know a lot of the Indian Americans, they love to say they came with $8 in their pockets. And I say, yeah, but you also came with IIT degrees. I mean, that's like saying, okay, I had $8, but I had an MIT degree. So we need to make sure that we're giving people the safety net that they can then go take a risk. But I think the decentralization will allow that, and figuring out, and I discuss in the book several proposals for the decentralization of finance. What Steve Case is doing is wonderful, but of 120 billion venture capital, I mean, I don't know, his fund, maybe 400, 500 million, that's great, but that's not going to be enough to scale unless we have the right policies.
Okay. We have someone from Cleveland that says, just wanted your thoughts on privacy and tech support for individuals to express bottom-up engagement with top-down management skinny funnels. So in other words, what can a lot of us do who are, on the ground, have an impact on the privacy issues?
I appreciate that. My wife's from Cleveland, huge Browns fan, so I appreciate your tuning in. Look, I think that the privacy is so important in multiple levels. It's privacy in terms of the workplace, as the viewer alludes to, is important, so that you know that you're not being surveilled by your employer, and having organizing to set those clear expectations with employers matters. Privacy in terms of the government, that you're not being tracked by the government matters. But that's why we need these Internet Bill of Rights that I propose, in some of the regulations that would prevent both private companies and the government from surveilling it. Someone asked, well, Internet Bill of Rights, don't we already have the Bill of Rights? And I said, of course we do. This is not reinventing new rights, but it's saying, how do we apply and safeguard those rights in a digital age? What does it mean to apply the Bill of Rights in a digital age, and what are the policies we need to be able to safeguard our rights, especially in a workplace of surveillance?
So I got to ask this question. We have Timothy, who submitted a question all the way from Normandy, France. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. How would you suggest digital literacy programs to evolve in the future to best tackle all the digital, all the issues digital raises worldwide? That's a big question.
Yeah, well, let me first compliment France in this regard. The universal preschool that we're debating today, with the president's proposal to get 3- and 4-year-olds preschool and access to an education, because before you could have digital literacy, you still need literacy. France did that in 1890. They went universal. I mean, we're about 100 years behind. And the Equitably system in France, by the time you're 5 or 6, whether you're a kid of a billionaire or working class, you start out at least at a decent level. So the first thing I would say is it's a prerequisite to have good education. And one of the things I talk about in my chapter on progressive capitalism is how while we need technical skills and computer skills and digital skills, the thing that we need the most for a lot of these entrepreneurs is good education, healthcare, nutrition. That's what a lot of them had. And that is as important as the technical education. But to the specific question on digital literacy, Finland is a great example. They had massive Russian disinformation. they started a program on digital literacy, not just for kids, but also adults. The libraries implemented it, and they've really combated a lot of the disinformation. Kids learned that what you read on a blog or online could be gossip. It's not the same thing as reading something in a newspaper in terms of vetting standards and how to see multiple sources. And adults had a similar education online. And so digital literacy, looking at places like France, which has done it, Finland, which has done it well, is a big part of the solution to some of the challenges we face.
Okay, here's one that's very specific, sort of giving you a heads up on the fairness doctrine. Gail asks, the FCC discarded the fairness doctrine in 1985, which had required contrasting viewpoints to be presented by licensed entities. Given all the one-sided digital forums, is there a role for an FCC-type digital platform to re-examine this?
Well, I supported the fairness doctrine, and I guess what I think a fairness doctrine in the internet age could be could do is have digital common spaces, the PBS of the internet nationally and locally, like Nextdoor that I was talking about, where you could have opportunities for community conversation and everyone having an equal voice and reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. I think it's hard on a platform like Facebook or Twitter to have a fairness doctrine where you have millions of people. I mean, what would you do every time I was attacked or someone was attacked? Would you have us have a right to reply? I think that would be probably very complicated. But having a new platform of fairness where it rules of equal participation in a community and nationally, and creating more discursive spaces so you have an antitrust enforcement, I think would be healthy.
Okay. So question, it's kind of, so science has been a big, because of COVID. So actually there are two questions here, maybe very quickly. One is what do you think the impact of COVID is going to be on the agenda that you're talking about? And, you devoted a chapter on science and, how technology can support that or not support that. So maybe you could just give us a couple of quick thoughts on those two subjects.
Well, COVID created a forced experiment with remote work. When I was talking about these ideas 5 years ago, people said, "Oh, this is never going to work. You can't have tech jobs and semiconductor jobs and all these jobs across the country." And now one of the venture capitalists who read my book, a very thoughtful person, had a critique saying, "Ro, I don't understand why you need to write this book. We're already doing all of this. We're recruiting all over the country." So it's gone from impossible to inevitable in 5 years. And I think that's because of COVID. Now, just to be clear, 80% of the venture capital is still in 3 states, and there's a lot of policy that's needed, but at least we're now not swimming against the stream. On science and technology, one of the points I make there is that we've got to be less hectoring and less certain of sort of lecturing people saying you're not with the science. A lot of the science disputes are actually values disputes, and we have to figure out how we include them in a conversation. And the chapter starts with this person, Matt Russell, who instead of browbeating farmers to be for climate science, includes farmers in the conversation in church basements. And they lead to this conclusion that farmers want to develop regenerative agriculture, be paid for it, and buy in much more to the science when they feel they're included in the conversations about their values. Thomas Hobbes has this famous saying that if it was in a person's interest to deny that a triangle had 3 sides, they would deny a triangle had 3 sides. And a lot of things I think that we view as scientific disputes are actually values disputes. Giving more people participation with respect in those values disputes may help us build more consensus on the issues of science.
So I'm curious about your view. I mean, what was really interesting about the book is that you've talked with so many people, right? Whether it's, from people, everyday people that you've met in different parts of the country, CEOs. In your mind, I mean, everyone just takes as a granted, we're more partisan than we ever have been. But when you look at the actual solutions that people are talking about, in your mind, is there an overlap? Do you see an overlap? It'd be one thing if there was nothing, okay? But I'm just wondering your sense of, you're out there. What is your sense? Is it as bad as people are saying, or is it as bad as perhaps, some of our news networks want us to believe?
I think there is overlap on policy, obviously on the Competes Act, the Endless Frontiers Act, which I helped lead, which we passed in the House, Senate, That's going to create semiconductor manufacturing, the CHIPS Act, 52 billion for things like Intel to Ohio. It's going to have 200 billion in science and technology investment that was passed in the Senate with Mitch McConnell's vote. I'm working with Senator Rubio to unleash the federal financing bank to help create more factories and productive capacity in America. But I think the division is deeper. One, from a partisan perspective, if you permit me this, the Democrats need to stop every speech with all the things that are wrong with America. People don't respond to that leadership. People want what is hopeful, what is positive about America. And we have a real challenge because the Republicans, in a philosophical sense, emphasize every Kevin McCarthy speech says, I'm going to protect your way of life. And there's a concern about, is America changing? And on the Democratic side, of course, we embrace a lot of the change, but we have to embrace it also contextualized within the rich traditions of American history. And this is the debate. How do we emerge as a great nation that respects our traditions and histories, but includes sufficient space for new voices? And what is that balance? What is the balance of saying it's okay to celebrate baseball as a pastime, but allow Ro and his friends to watch cricket in Fremont? And how do we balance that? These are difficult questions, and we ought to give ourselves some credit. We're trying to do something that no country has ever done in the history of the world. And that's, I think, one of the reasons, coupled with the economic dislocations and neglect that our country is going through these polarized times. But I would just quote one of my favorite philosophers, John Rawls, who's 1,000 times more brilliant than me. And that's not a hyperbole, it's just the truth. He's one of the great philosophers. And Rawls, no matter, even though he was so brilliant, had this view of not coming with judgment immediately in the conversations, not coming with an air of superiority, not coming with a sense that I'm a better, more moral human being. This is the person who wrote the theory of justice. And I think if we just had a little bit more humility in how we approach conversations with fellow Americans, it would go a long way.
Okay. We got 1 minute. And as much as I want to end on what I thought was a great note of humility, and empathy, which is really important. I always ask this question. You put all this effort into this book. We spent an hour with us. Thank you very much. If there's one or two takeaways, we've got about 30 seconds or so before I have to pass off to Bill. What would be those two takeaways that you want people to just remember, if nothing else, from this conversation?
Be more hopeful.
Remember a lot, but I want to know what your priorities are.
Be more hopeful about the American project and our prospects of becoming a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. We're making progress and we're on the right trajectory, and it was never going to be a linear line from Obama on, but we're going to succeed, and there's a path to succeed. And second, let's make sure that in that path to succeed, we give every citizen the opportunity to be productive in the modern economy. People don't just need a fair chance to start. They want the opportunity to contribute, to produce value. Americans are a proud people, and we have to give people those opportunities.
Okay, on that note, we've run out of time, and I just want to thank Congressman Ro Khanna with his book here. I hope it's transcribed okay. Dignity in a Digital Age. And thank you so much. And Bill, I pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Philip. And Congressman Khanna, I'm going to try to exert a little privilege here if I can squeeze an extra minute of your time, because
of course
you serve on the House committees on agriculture, armed services, and you chair the environmental subcommittee of oversight and reform. This is a great cross-section of many employers, of job creators. And on the topic of dignified employment, I wonder what your thoughts are on a 4-day work week or a 35-hour work week, and whether that would create space for citizens of the 21st century.
I have not supported that. Maybe it's because I've worked 60, 70 hours that even though people don't think members of Congress do, and so I have, I think I focused on getting increased wages for folks at the 40-hour work week. We are a very hardworking people as Americans, and that stretches all classes. And my concern is, let's have paid family leave. Let's have people get time off to be with their relatives. Let's make sure that people are being paid well. But let me tell you something. China is 4 times our size. We need to be 4 times productive. And I certainly want to make sure our values win the 21st century.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of my colleague, Philip Yun, who runs World Affairs in San Francisco, and you can find him on the World Affairs program on KQED and its affiliates, and for Congressman Khanna, thank you for being part of Cover to Cover. I think we covered a lot of ground today. Next episode will be March 23. We're staying with tech in a way, and we have a speaker who hangs her hat at Stanford University at the Hoover Institution. She's Amy Ziegart. She'll be speaking on her book, Spies, Lies, and Algorithms, The Future of Intelligence as it Collides with a Digital Revolution. So you make a great segue to that program, Congressman Khanna. Thank you so much again for your time and joining us at the World Affairs Councils today.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much.
And thanks to all of you around the country. Join us again March 23. Philip, we'll be seeing you. And good afternoon from Washington, D.C.